you a sense of who I am and how I came to working on this case. I began to work on this case when I was a young doctoral student in New York in the early 1990s, and as many of you might recall, the 90s were quite an incredible moment, both in the United States and around the world. It was the moment that certainly began a struggle against the death penalty in the United States, and Mumia Abu-Jamal became the face of that movement, but it was also the moment when the anti-globalization movement was pretty strong, and there were demonstrations in Germany and in France and in Brazil and other parts of Latin America and the world against capitalism. I remember that the IMF during that period was forced to make a statement that reflected at least the sentiments of the anti-globalization movement. Then, many years later, in 2002, I found myself at Carnegie Mellon University, now a professor, and I learned that Mumia was only an hour from Pittsburgh, where I was living at the time. I was approached by a very old professor who looked like Father Time, and he insisted that I go visit Mumia Abu-Jamal, having learned about him at a very young stage in my activist development, and as a young scholar, I was frightened. I said, what could I have to add to this man's life? I was a little scared, in fact. But I went to visit him, and I was teaching a course on the civil rights movement, and I decided to use his incredible book, We Want Freedom, A Life in the Black Panther Party. It's one of the best histories of the Black Panther Party, but also the movements of the 60s. So I used that in my classroom, and we figured out a way to have him call my classroom and have a live conversation from death row with my students. That conversation was breathtaking, and my students were perplexed because everything they had heard in the media about Mumia Abu-Jamal, especially coming out of Philadelphia, depicted Mumia as a monster, as a cop killer, and they were baffled to hear Mumia's very tempered voice. They were interested to hear that he sounds like a radio reporter and has the respectability of a radio reporter, but his message is transgressive indeed. So this connection between my students in this class and Mumia captured my imagination, and I realized that this voice, this message, this story of state repression against a fighter for justice, against a revolutionary who's innocent, has to be projected wider than my classroom. And then I proceeded to get together with a friend of mine who's a filmmaker, and we made the film entitled Justice on Trial, The Case of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And so this is my connection to Mumia. I've been visiting him now for 8 years regularly, and I am also now a part of the legal team. Even though I am not a lawyer, I'm a professor of history, but I serve in the capacity of consultant on the team. So I just wanted to give you a sense of who I am and my connection to him before I begin to talk about the case and where we are. I think it's very important now to give you a sense of where Mumia stands today. On December 7th of 2011, just last December, the DA, the District Attorney of Philadelphia, decided that he would not pursue another death sentence in the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And that very day, when he announced this to the press on December 7th, Mumia was transferred to what is called administrative custody. Essentially, that is a way station, a moment, a situation of transition, or a unit of transition between death row and general population, where he's going to be transferred and where he will serve a lifetime in prison without parole. Now, administrative custody is usually reserved for prisoners who are being disciplined by the state. The irony of this current situation for Mumia is that he is in a worse condition now, if you can imagine, than he was on death row. In many ways, what we see happening is that this is the last attempt on the part of the state to punish him for having successfully fought against his death sentence, for having successfully become, in the United States, the face against racism, the face of justice, and the face of defiance against the state. He has been in what is known as solitary confinement now for 37 days. That means that he is completely isolated with absolutely no human contact, and all of his privileges, not that there were many, on death row have been taken away from him. So again, he is in a very small cell. He does not have access to his typewriter. He does not have a television. He does not have a radio. He gets one visit one time a week for 1 hour. He has only one phone call that he has to request once a week. And if the person he calls doesn't answer the phone, he has to wait another week to request that call. So again, he is in his cell 23 hours a day. This kind of isolation has been determined to be by the international community torture. And this is the kind of system and state repression under which Americans in the United States keep people like Mumia. And behind Mumia, as you know, are hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions of other men and women, mostly black, mostly Latino, but mostly poor in the United States. In many ways, Mumia's situation in disciplinary custody is not like the situation under which we held people at Guantanamo Bay. Mumia is experiencing in the US, on American soil, the same kind of treatment, the same kind of sensory deprivation and torture that the United States conducted in Guantanamo Bay, and we have to stand here and say, we will not accept this. We will fight this kind of state repression. But the fact is, that they might keep him for 120 days, but they have to release him to general population, because the very courts of the United States, the Supreme Court of the United States in October of 2011 essentially said that Mumia should never have been on death row, that for 30 years he was held unconstitutionally on death row by the very own standards of this repressive state that upholds the death penalty. That means that the other side, right, the side of the politicians, of the district attorney, of the Fraternal Order of Police, of the judges, of the courts, of the prosecution that has for 30 years been trying to execute Mumia Abu-Jamal, their side just experienced a horrific defeat, and that's a victory for us.